Hi, how's it going? I'm Marlene. Thanks for wandering by. Welcome back to Decan Walk 2023. This is a series where we are walking through the zodiacal wheel of the year and we're paying attention to the tarot correspondences to astrology, traditional Western astrology, and those tarot correspondences that were laid down by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. For those of you that are interested in knowing more specifically what decans are and about this Decan Walk, you can go ahead and visit my description box below where I leave a playlist of all the videos that I've done so far. If you want to engage with us in further discussion, you can join the Boho Tarot Facebook group where we are posting and discussing the Decan Walk more. So, welcome back. We are entering a new zodiac sign. So, the last zodiac sign that we were working with and in the time of year was Libra. And I took a break at the very end of Libra season for the last decan of Libra, which was Libra 3. And the tarot card that corresponded there is the Four of Swords. So it was a perfect time to take a break. So now I'm back and well rested, and I hope all of you are ready to kind of kick things back up. And we're heading into Scorpio season, which is like full of mystery and sensuality and intuitiveness, and it's a water sign, so there's so much fun stuff to take a look at in Scorpio. So I brought out these cards from the Star Codes Astro Oracle. As always, I'll have links in the description box below for all of the books and cards, decks, and resources that I'm showing along the way. So yeah, so what I've started doing as I've gotten further into this walk is when we hit a new zodiac sign, I've been trying to do some research and sharing just a little bit with you about what I've learned about that particular zodiac sign. So Scorpio, my goodness, I love the idea of Scorpio, although I knew very little about Scorpio, and now, I guess I know a little bit more now, having read some about it. But Scorpio is one of those signs that, like, I wish that I were a Scorpio, but I'm not. I'm a Gemini, just because they seem so, like, dark and brooding and goth and emo and mysterious and full of so much sensuality. And yeah, I just really like the idea of Scorpio. So here we have a keyword for Scorpio, which is investigate, which I think is really interesting. Scorpio is, and I'm going to read from a couple other of the books that I have just to share with us a little bit about Scorpio. In classical, traditional Western astrology, Scorpio is ruled by the planet Mars. And so for our tarot correspondences, Mars is going to be the ruling planet. But you'll find in more modern astrology that Scorpio is also associated or ruled by by Pluto. But for us here, we're going to stick with Mars as the association. And then also because Scorpio is the 8th sign, it's associated or rules the 8th house. And so the 8th house from this deck, the keyword here is mystery. Oh, and the keyword for Mars was motion, which I think is really interesting that Mars is motion. But anyway, what I'd like to do next is do a little bit of a dive into Scorpio, and then we'll get into our deck. So this is the guidebook for the Karma Cards deck that is by Monty Farber. And I looked up Scorpio and I just really wanted to read this to you. For me, the understanding of Western astrology and the zodiac correspondences is so completely seasonal, and it makes a lot of sense that way in terms of the seasons. So Scorpio the Scorpion, October 24th to November 22nd. So the sun's entrance into the sign of Scorpio was a matter of life and death. The sun's heat was dying, as were the crops, the flowers, and the leaves of the trees. The least prized of the livestock were killed, and the meat preserved for the coming winter. All this death must have reminded our ancestors of their own mortality, but they realized that the leaves and the perennial crops and flowers would be back in the spring, and the annual crops and flowers would live on through their seeds. The animals that were killed would live on in their offspring and through the people who ate their flesh to survive. The reality of a kind of life after death in their everyday world suggested the possibility of a life after death in the spiritual world for our ancestors. So Scorpio has a lot to do with death and sexuality, life and death, sex and death, and yeah, cycles of life and death. And it makes perfect sense for this particular time of year in the northern hemisphere. So association. Scorpio is associated with the most powerful magical mysteries in our lives. Sex, a life or death matter, if ever there was one, death and resurrection, power and change. Yeah, change and transformation is something that we see associated with Scorpio, with scorpions, and with the sign of Scorpio. The parts of the body ruled by Scorpio are the eliminative and reproductive organs. So that's really cool. So of course, reproductive organs, and it has to do, it's connected to sex, right? I also like to use the Library of Esoterica astrology volume to take a look at the Scorpio, what it says about Scorpio in here. Okay, so this book is giant, so I had to move everything around. Okay, so here we have Scorpio. So the ruler of Scorpio, like I told you already, we have Mars, but then we also have Pluto in more modern astrology. We have its natural house is the 8th house. I already said Scorpio runs from October 23rd to November 21st, and it's the 8th sign. There's our glyph. So its duality is negative, or you can say feminine. The element is water and the quality is fixed. So Scorpio comes right in the middle of its season. So in the northern hemisphere, that season is fall. So Scorpio season is right in the middle of the fall season. Its polarity, so its opposite sign, is Taurus. It is connected to the death card in the tarot, and I can't wait to get into that. And it is associated with the metal, with iron. Okay, so I like to just read this little blurb that appears here at the front of the chapter on Scorpio. So shamanistic transmutation, transition, change, all of these keywords are very much associated with Scorpio. Over here, we have the picture of this woman, and then it's a scorpion and a snake and an eagle. And so these are said to be the 3 different stages of Scorpio, which I think is really cool. I'll read down here. So 3 animals associated with the sign. The scorpion, the snake, and the eagle represent stages in a Scorpio's life. Youth, instinct, water, development, discernment, and the earth, and maturity, the eagle, transcendence, in the air. And I thought that was really cool. So here we go. Scorpios are the alchemists. The Scorpio born have the faculty of utilizing to good advantage many things considered useless to others, and this quality, added to their strength of will and determination, usually results in success. Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I read this already, and then I read more about Scorpio, and I read about just how the sign of Scorpio is really this like embodiment of transformation and change. And so we already saw that it's associated with the death card, so that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, coming together Scorpio at this time of year, during the time of Samhain, Halloween, and it all kind of makes a lot of sense. So now, without further ado, let's take a look at our decan, the first decan of Scorpio. Okay, so here we go. We are in the first decan of Scorpio, which is Mars in Scorpio, fixed water. So we already talked about that. Scorpio is a water sign, and it is fixed because it is in the middle of its season, okay? And it is going from, the first decan goes from October 23rd to November 2nd. So we looked at the dates of the whole of Scorpio, which is going to be, you know, all 3 decans. But this first decan is 10 days, spanning from October 23rd to November 2nd. And it's our 5 of Cups. And so this is the Rider-Waite-Smith depiction. This card comes from the Divine Decan Tarot, which I talk about each time, that it was kindly gifted to me by Reese Marin and has been my, you know, best study tool here for decks throughout this Decan Walk. So then we have the keyword here, which is disappointment, which actually is the same keyword that you see on Crowley's Tarot and the Thoth Tarot, but it is actually not the Hermetic title of this card. I have from the Hermetic Tarot, the 5 of Cups here, and the Golden Dawn titled this card, Lord of Loss in Pleasure. And Crowley uses the word disappointment. So that's the word that you see on the Thoth Tarot, which I have my trimmed version here, but disappointment is the title that you see on the Thoth Tarot. So this is the card of, you know, of loss and regret and sadness. It's very clear and obvious. And so it's going to be interesting for us to take a look at how we arrive at this particular card when we're taking a look at Mars in Scorpio. So we know that we have the 5 of Cups, and then we know that it has its planetary ruler. So there's a major card that's associated with the planetary ruler of this decan, and we know that there's a card that's associated with the sign of Scorpio. So the Death card is the sign that's associated with Scorpio. And if you remember from past decans, we know that Mars is associated with the Tower. Oh, and you can see here modern Pluto, which I think is interesting. So Mars is the Tower, and Mars is the planetary ruler of the decan, but it is also, like we said, the planetary ruler of the sign of Scorpio. So it's like lots of Mars energy going on here as well. So here's our Death card, probably my favorite Death card ever, just ever at all, is the Death card in the Thoth Tarot. And then we have the Mars card from the Thoth Tarot as well. And I'll show you some other cards from the 8th house tarot in just a minute. But if you take a look, like I always like to do, is look at the colors in the Thoth Tarot, and you can see where these colors came together. Now, I've not done a proper color scale study yet, and that's on my list of things to do, but you can see where these reds and yellows, in the oranges come in, the black, the blues, the greens, like it's all there. And on the Thoth, it has our planetary and zodiac glyphs. So Mars in Scorpio. All right, so why don't we take a look at one more deck, and then we'll get into the books. Here are the cards from the 8th house tarot, which is another deck that I've been using along the way. And here is the 5 of Water, or the 5 of Cups, which is Mars in Scorpio. And we can see that this is a real Rider-Waite-Smith leaning card, because we have our figure, and they are, we have our 3 cups that are spilled and 2 cups that are still standing behind this figure. But what's really cool is that we have the red planet kind of behind her. So it's that nod to Mars. And I'm not sure if we think that this is water at all here where she's standing. I don't know. It's a little bit, you know, surreal. And so this is the death card in the 8th house tarot, which is really cool. It's like these different layers of this rose. I can't really kind of detect what's going on behind it, but I love a red rose as a symbol for death. And then we have our tower card, which we've seen before, and we have the lightning striking the tower, and then these like onlookers. This is a really intense card, especially in the modern era. Yeah, so very, very intense there. So yeah, so these are the cards from the 8th house tarot. And now, you know, let's take a look at the cards from the Hermetic tarot, which is a deck that I got more recently. And we already took a look at the 5 of Cups. And so it has our Hermetic title on it, Lord of Loss and Pleasure. And then I haven't studied this yet, but it definitely has our signs, right? So it has Mars and Scorpio on it. And then it's reminiscent too of the Thoth card, right? Because it has our inverted pentagram on the card as well, which I think is really neat. And the lily pad. So yeah, it's very Thothy as well. And then we have our death card here, which has a scorpion on it. That's really cool. It has the symbol for Scorpio, and it has, oh my gosh, this is a badass card. I could just sink into this one and taking a look at it. It's really cool. It's very cool. I mean, it's a little Thothy, but it really is doing its own thing. I mean, there's obviously the scorpion here in the death card as well, and the snake. You also see the snake and the eagle, right? Yep, there's our eagle. So our 3 transformations, our 3 stages of Scorpio are represented on the death card, among other things. And then here's the blasted tower, Lord of the hosts of the mighty. And then the Hermetic title for death is Child of the Great Transformers, Lord of the hosts of the mighty. And so we have our very, blasted tower. There's the tree of life is represented here as well. That's really, really cool. I've not looked at this deck yet in depth. I've been just, kind of taking it as we go through. So yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to do through the Decan Walk is figure out how our main, major cards, how those coming together create our minor cards. So how does the influence of the tower and death come together to create the 5 of Cups, And it seems pretty obvious. It seems very obvious that we have 2 pretty intense cards here, and their associations coming together, giving us what feels like loss and regret, disappointment, loss in pleasure, disappointment. I get into Susan Chang's 36 Secrets. The other book that has been vital for me so far is Tarot and Astrology by Corinne Kenner. And I really like, at the beginning of each new zodiac sign, she does a page that looks like this, where we're heading into the 3 decans of Scorpio, and it gives us, it tells us fixed water, and that we're going to be doing the 5, 6, and 7 of Cups. So those will be our 3 decans in Scorpio. And I really like it because she goes through and she says this: as we study the cards and the characters in the cards, remember that they'll all share the same attributes of the sign. So there are specific things about Scorpio that we want to remember as we go through each of the 3 decans in and under or whatever Scorpio. So we talked about this already, but Scorpio, the 8th sign of the zodiac, is the sign of sex, death, transformation, and other people's money. That's also what it says about the 8th house. So all three of these cards in Scorpio depict people dealing with intense issues, which I think is, yeah, it really lends to the idea of Scorpio. The mode or quality is fixed. So some things that I have maybe mentioned, but not probably in depth, is that a fixed sign, because it's stationed securely in the middle of the month, in the middle month of the, in the middle of the season, so the middle month of fall, the corresponding cards from the middle of the suit embody stable and persistent energy. So that's another way to think about Scorpio. It's a very stable and persistent energy, albeit very intense. So the element is water. And so those of us that are familiar, with the tarot, we kind of have that understanding of the water suit, right? The cups, that it is emotions, changeable, subtle, intuitive, and flowing. So while its mode and quality is stable and persistent, it's also subtle, intuitive, changeable, and flowing. And then remember that the Scorpion itself is it's connected to change and transformation. So all this is really interesting. It's duality, so it's feminine, so it's receptive, reactive, magnetic, responsive, and patient, and their energies flow in a circular pattern. So this also tells us the corresponding majors, the death card, and then this book talks about the modern astrology, so it talks about Pluto, but I myself go with the Golden Dawn, and I wrote it here. I go with the Golden Dawn Association, the classical planets. So it's Mars, okay? So Mars is the ruling planet of Scorpio, and it's also the planetary ruler of this first decan of Scorpio. So just a couple of things to point out. Also, that Corinne Kenner says, and that I've mentioned, is that it's not a coincidence that Halloween falls during the first decan of Scorpio. So this is the time of year where the veil is thin, and then the souls of the dead can slip effortlessly back and forth. So Scorpio is well acquainted with the dark mysteries of life. So now let's visit with our buddy Susan Chang and see what she has to say about this particular card, this decan. It seems pretty obvious to me that when you put the energies of the Tower and Death together, that what you're going to get is something very much like the Five of Cups. So Susan Chang says about this card that for a minor card, it is grim, one of the grimmest there are, which starts to make sense when you look at its two corresponding major arcana, the Tower and Death. So something else that she points out that I wanted to point out to you guys as well is that she says, it seems somehow inevitable that the Death card should be associated with the sign of Scorpio, but it wasn't inevitable, really. So the zodiacal correspondences of the majors weren't laid down until the 19th century, a good 400 years after the first tarot cards began to appear in Europe, okay? So to review, there's a list of the correspondences established by the Golden Dawn. So on page 151, if you have this book, if you have 36 Secrets, on page 151 is where she has the correspondences between the majors and the zodiac as laid down by the Golden Dawn. And these are just the zodiac signs. It doesn't include the planets, okay? These are just the zodiac signs. So Scorpio is Death not only seems to match up with Scorpio's painted black 8th house goth reputation, it also pairs beautifully with the supremely gloomy 5 of Cups, complete with a cloak of mourning. Here, let's look at this more. Whose associated decan just happens to include, it's just so crazy how that works out. I mean, like seasonally, with Western astrology, with Scorpio, with, it just all makes sense. That this is the Mars and Scorpio card. So it just happens to include everybody's favorite Western Hemisphere death festivals, Halloween and the Day of the Dead, All Hallows Eve and All Saints Day, Samhain and Dia de los Muertos. So that goes together. So right, and in the Northern Hemisphere, as the northern sunlight withdraws from the visible landscape, leaving behind bare branches and dry ground, we acknowledge life's cyclical nature for all growing things and for ourselves as well. So the idea of death. We have our ideas of death here, especially at this particular time of year. So that Scorpio energy is strong, right? The Scorpio energy, the death energy, the cycles of life and death come through pretty clearly. So now let's talk about how much Mars energy we have here with the Tower. So the death card alongside Scorpio, it's just perfect. It makes 100% sense as a sign of transformation, as a sign linked to cycles of sex, death, life, all of that kind of stuff in the mix here. And then we have all this Mars energy, because Mars is the Decan ruler. It's the planetary ruler of the sign. So we have just so much Mars going on. And Susan Chang talks about that as well. So much Mars. So if death shows us what we fear, then the Tower shows us why. So what she points out is that we're not afraid, some people might be, but we're not afraid of death coming at the end of a life well lived, peacefully dying in our sleep, or someone dying, once they're old, and it's, they've lived a long, good life. What we're afraid of, rather, is a sudden death. What she says is this: but what we fear above all else is not the familiar seasonal procession or dying in our sleep after a full and happy life. What we fear is sudden death. And here, she argues, is the presence of Mars. So we fear sudden, unexpected, cataclysmic change. Whereas the natural cycles of life and death change are here. Mars and the Tower bring in an energy of something, in motion. That's really interesting too. Just thought of that. Of something that is like unexpected, that is, sudden, unexpected, you're completely unprepared for. She talks about why this matters so much in the Five of Cups. And she says that no other card, as we go through our 36 decans, expresses a planet as powerfully as the Five of Cups does with Mars. So she lays down 4 different ways that Mars is connected. First of all, the Five of Cups is the sign of Scorpio, and the ruler is Mars. Okay, we said that already. She says I don't understand this one, so I have to look it up. Scorpio is a nocturnal sign, and Mars is nocturnal insect. I'm not sure what that means, but that's another Mars connection. The Five of Cups corresponds with the first decan of Scorpio, whose ruler is Mars. So we have that again. And there's a tree of life connection too, because all the fives correspond to the Sephira Geburah on the tree of life. And the planet of Geburah is Mars. So that's like Mars, 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 and more Mars. Okay, so it is giant in this particular decan. She talks about how Mel Meline, who's her co-host of the podcast Fortune's Wheelhouse, calls this emotional severity, because we are in the suit of the emotions when we're in the cups. And she says it's a pithy way to describe the shock and dismay of sudden loss. When Mars brings death, he brings it swiftly and ruthlessly in combat or through accidents and disasters. So, yeah, that's pretty terrifying. And it makes sense, though, but it makes sense that our figure here is posed the way that they are, and that we have, you know, this imagery that we have throughout the Five of Cups is one of, it's, you know, regret, loss, sadness, and it's a little bit foreboding, right? Nobody wants to get the Five of Cups. You know, it's not a card that you want to see come up in your readings. She also says that what we feel at the moment of the Five of Cups is bereavement. It's the sudden, sharp sense of loss. And it might, you know, rarely does death, when death comes up, does it mean like actual death, but rather a transformation or a change. And this card, you know, it's like punctuating that really deeply intense emotion of bereavement and loss. And it brings, you know, because Mars and Scorpio are coming together, a kind of monstrous hunger for what is no longer ours. So yeah, I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that all of these ideas come together quite clearly in this loss, regret, bereavement card. Whether it's the loss of an actual physical person, loved one, or, you know, something else that is gone, you know, a disappointment. Disappointment is a less intense word than grief and loss. But it's very clear to me that this card, it came about because we have these two very intense major cards here. It is a deep sense of disappointment, which is what Angeles Arian talks about in the Tarot Handbook. So Tarot Handbook by Angeles Arian is another one of my favorite books to reference for the Decan Walk. I really enjoy what she has to say. And so she has a very deep focus into the astrology, and she's keying into the word disappointment. And so she talks about the Five of Cups as emotional disappointment. Disappointment makes you feel fragile, breakable, and vulnerable, like the glass cups represented on this symbol. Disappointment is a state where you experience emotional depression, like these murky seas, and anger, like the red sky. Disappointment takes us off balance, which is symbolized by the askewed star, and makes us feel uprooted like the lily pads with falling lotus blossoms. So you see, the roots of the lily pad make the shape of a butterfly. I never noticed that before in the Thoth card, that these roots here are the shape of a butterfly, which is a universal symbol for transformation. Hello, we're bringing the death card definitely back in here now. So she says, the astrological aspect of this card is Mars in Scorpio, Tower, and death, right? Mars is the planet that is associated with energy, vitality, and assertion. Like Mars, this is disappointment that is deep and vital. This is disappointment that goes to a very deep level, like Scorpio, right? Scorpio is associated with the depths. And that is not a superficial disappointment. So it's funny because I know I took a break and didn't do the Four of Swords. So the last card that I really spent some deep, intense time with was the Three of Swords. And that is often called the heartbreak card, right? But truthfully, truly, in my mind, the heartbreak card is here. This is the heartbreak card in the Five of Cups, because this is true disappointment, true bereavement and loss, grieving on a very deep emotional level, and brought about perhaps, by something sudden and unexpected. Because it's not the natural way of things like this suggests, right? The Scorpio suggests a natural transformation. Rather, this is a disappointment because the loss, was unexpected. And I think that's a really interesting way to take a look at the Five of Cups if it comes up for us in a reading, and what that metaphor means for us in our lives. I also really, really love all the seasonal ties that we have in here, what coming up on Samhain, Halloween time, and, experiencing like decay and death in terms of like the growing things around us that the karma cards talked about when we talked about Scorpio. And this time of year, it's the very last bit of life before the winter. So yeah, all of these ideas coming together are pretty intertwined. So it's not like we are having to kind of puzzle together something that seems incongruous. In fact, all of these things just really make perfect sense to, I think, the human heart. That when you're faced with loss, like this image just feels so palpable and true. Yeah, so that is it for me. That is our Five of Cups, our Decan 1 of Scorpio, and I hope that you all enjoyed that. And as always, I'll leave a link to the PDF of the spread that I am creating, or that I have created for us for this particular Decan. And I hope that you all have a beautiful, wonderful first Decan of Scorpio and a beautiful, wonderful day. Bye.